In this video, we'll introduce JSON, short for JavaScript Object Notation, a popular format for exchanging data between systems using web services. JSON is used to represent complex data in a text format, which makes JSON fairly human-readable. We'll see a lot of JSON as we dive deeper into the web services in the upcoming videos, so it's important to understand its structure here. We won't be covering every aspect of JSON, but this video will give you enough information to look at a web service payload and recognize what it says. First, JSON may look familiar if you've ever done any JavaScript programming because it's the way we represent complex data in that language. However, just because it has JavaScript in the name, you don't need to use JavaScript to create JSON objects. JSON can be created and used by many programming languages. JavaScript is useful because it's a common scripting language for web pages, and it's also the native scripting language on the Now platform. JavaScript also includes simple methods for converting JSON text to an object and JSON objects to text. As a quick review, simple data, also known as primitive data, consists of things like single number, string or Boolean value. Complex data is a combination of those elements and may also include arrays, objects, and objects within other objects, and even arrays of objects. If all this sounds confusing, I recommend watching the video series Learn JavaScript on the Now platform. Let's take a look at some examples. Here's how we would represent a simple person object with the first name and last name using JSON. The curly braces tell us it's an object. First underscore name is a property with a value of Chuck, and last underscore name is a property with the value of Tomasi. Note the comma to separate the two property value pairs. You may also note that Chuck and Tomasi have quotes because they are strings. Not all values will have quotes. For example, numbers and Booleans or true-false values do not. If they had quotes, they'd be considered strings, and we'd have to do some type conversion to get them represented properly in the system. Okay, let's take a look at another example. We've got the first name and last name as before. We also have a numeric score and a Boolean active property. Notice that office is an object within our object with its own set of properties, street, city, and state. And we have an array of strings named videos. This shows how we can combine different data types together to create a single complex object. For simplicity's sake, let's go back to the first example. Spaces, tabs, and new lines, also known as white spaces, are added to make it easier for human beings to read, but the machine really doesn't care. It could have been written as one line and still represent the same information. While the machine doesn't care, most people find JSON easier to read with the extra white spaces. If you happen to get JSON text that is not in an easy-to-read format, there are online websites you can use to beautify your JSON. Here's some sample text that's fairly long and in one line. As you can see, it's pretty tough to understand the structure, let alone reference a specific property. Let's search for a JSON beautifier in our browser. Pick one. Paste in some sample JSON and tell it to do its thing. And there's our JSON, all pretty and easy to read. Let's take a closer look at this object using the View option on this site. We can see we have an object by the curly braces with several properties: info, path, tags, and so on. Info, for example, is an object with several properties, some of which are deeper objects. Tags, on the other hand, is an array, where each element is an object containing a name and a description. When we switch to the text view, we can see, for example, that our first paths object has a property called x-premium that has a true value. No quotes, so we know it's a Boolean data type. So let's say a web service returns a payload to us like this, and we want to reference that email address in the info section. The first step is to take this text returned from the web service and convert it to a JavaScript object. Then we can .walk to the properties and referenced array elements programmatically. In the case of the email address, it might look something like this: assuming response body contains all that returned JSON text. We first use JSON.parse to turn the text into an object so JavaScript can understand it. Next, we reference the object properties as they cascade down to where we want: object.info.contact.email. Let's take another example where we want the name of the first tag. That might look something like this. We start at obj, then we reference the first element of the tag array as element 0, and then we get the name property from that. We've seen how JSON.parse takes JSON text and converts it to a JavaScript object. To reverse the process, we convert a JavaScript object to text by using JSON.stringify. Here's a simple example of creating an object and then stringifying it. We first define the object either literally as shown or programmatically, then use JSON.stringify on the object to turn it into a string, and finally use gs.info to output to the log. Note that it's a single line. If you want your output to be pretty, you can use a variation of JSON.stringify like this to get your 4-space indentation, and then it will look like this, which is much easier. Another tip for making your JSON easier to read on the Now platform is to set the dictionary attribute JSON_view to true on a string field. Let's take a look. Here we have a large text field with some JSON in it. Instead of copying and pasting it to an external beautifier, we're going to use an admin account to right-click on the field label and configure the dictionary entry. From there, we'll go down to the attributes related list and create a new entry. We use the name JSON_view and set the value to true, then submit. Now, when we look at the field, we see this small icon next to the field label. When we click it, we get a pop-out window that shows our JSON in a beautified format. This should give you a good idea of how to read and use JSON so you can extract the data you want from complex objects.